Hello, in this video I'm going to be showing why the Richat Structure, or the Eye of the Sahara, isn't Atlantis. And this is the third part of a three-part presentation. And so this is what Plato's Atlantis is supposed to look like. It's supposed to look something like an archery target with a bullseye in the middle and then rings around the bullseye. And you have rings of water and land, and each of the rings' measurements has been provided by Plato in his account. So we really know what we're looking for. And it seems like we found it, right? It seems like we found Atlantis. This is known as the Richat Structure, or the Eye of the Sahara. It was first discovered really by spacecraft when we sent satellites up into space and they imaged the Earth's surface. Someone noticed that there was a feature with concentric rings, and it wasn't immediately identified as Atlantis, but over the years, various researchers have claimed that this was Atlantis, and this idea has gained a lot of popularity ever since the channel named Bright Insight published a video implying that this was Atlantis and providing various forms of evidence to support that hypothesis. But this is another view of the Richat Structure, or the Eye of the Sahara. And this is where it's actually located. It's located in the western part of Africa, maybe around 300 miles inland from the Atlantic coast. And there's only one problem. Plato was actually very specific, not about just the city itself, but where the city was and the geography of its immediate region. Plato specified that the city was actually located in a plain that was of an oblong shape, and that the plain itself was surrounded by mountains. I'm not going to read this whole passage because I don't want to bore you. Let's just get straight to the point, and I'll show you a picture that shows what this passage is describing. This is what the city of Atlantis. The city of Atlantis is located right here. And it's located on a plain, right? This is the plain. And the plain itself is actually surrounded by mountains. And it just happens that I used blue for my background, but it's actually very convenient because these mountains were also said to descend to the sea. So if you think of this as the sea right here, that's actually would be an accurate description of the geography of Atlantis as a whole, not just the city, but the entire island continent. And so you have a situation where these mountains, these surrounding mountains, which go all the way around, here in Plato's dialogues, were described as celebrated for their number and beauty and size, far beyond any which still exist. That's the key phrase, right? That's the key phrase here. It's not that they were just mountains, it's that they were celebrated for their number and size and beauty, far beyond any which still exists. That's not just saying, hey, these are mountains. These are incredibly impressive and imposing mountains that are worth mentioning in that way. And it also says that they don't exist anymore. That's also relevant. And so just for your information, this plain was 2,000 by 3,000 stadia in dimensions, which is around 340 miles by 228 miles, or 230 miles, let's say. So it's around maybe the size of, it's smaller than Colorado or Wyoming. It's around the size of, I'd say, Washington State. Okay, so let's compare that with what the Richat Structure's overall geography is, especially its surrounding areas. You have the Richat Structure right here. You kind of have a plain right here. That plain is kind of the right size. It's not perfect, but it's close. But the problem is the mountains. These mountains are not impressive at all. These mountains are less than 2,000 feet high. This mountain range is less than 2,000 feet high, and so that's not impressive by any standard, is it? And one can suppose, for example, and I'll actually show you um, first-hand proof of that. I'm not going to just expect you to take me at my word when I say that these mountain ranges aren't very high. You can clearly see that the elevation, which you see on the top, the bottom right here, the elevation, these mountains are, none of these mountains are over 2,000 feet high. And so the idea that these surrounding mountains were celebrated for their size and beauty would just be completely, would not make any sense at all. And the idea is that maybe the Egyptians were kind of saying, because it says that the mountains don't exist anymore, right? It says here that the mountains don't exist, but maybe the Egyptians assumed that the mountains had been destroyed when Atlantis was destroyed. We can understand it that way, and that gets rid of the seeming contradiction. But one could also argue that the Egyptians were ignorant about world geography, and they didn't really know that there were mountain ranges that were that high. And so um, when they were saying that these mountains were incredibly high, they might have just been saying that compared to the very, very low mountains in their immediate environment. For example, Egypt doesn't have very many high mountains, so if they say these mountains were higher than any which still exist, they could just be imagining this tiny mountain range compared to what they have in Egypt, not what we know exists throughout the entire world. But I don't think that argument really stands either, because if you look at this passage when the Egyptian priest is speaking to Solon, the Egyptian priest is talking about the geography of Greece, not just as it existed at the time they were speaking, but the changes in the geography of Greece over the last thousands of years. And so that's not very, that's not consistent with what we know about Egypt and their level of scientific understanding. But, but if we're going to, but the Richat structure, we are saying, people who say that the Richat structure is Atlantis are using all of the details in Plato's dialogues to support their argument. So one cannot just ignore conveniently the other things that the Egyptian priest is saying about Atlantis just because it's inconsistent with what we think. You have to kind of just take all of it at the same time. You can't just pick and choose which parts of the narrative that you want to accept and reject. And so here the Egyptian priest is going into an incredibly detailed discussion about the changes in the geography of Greece over the last 9,000 years. And it could be argued that this Egyptian priest is actually talking about the rising sea levels and the transformation of Greece from a much a greater area of land to a smaller amount of land that's remaining as the sea levels rose. So here the Egyptian priest is talking about a mere skeleton of the land being left compared to what there once was. And that's exactly what would have happened over the last 9,000 years. And so if the Egyptians knew about what was happening in Greece over the last 9,000 years before the time of Solon, which was 600 BC, I think it's safe to assume that they were aware of other mountain ranges in the Mediterranean area and in the Near East. For example, the Atlas Mountains, the Alps, the mountains in Turkey, the Zagros Mountains. And I'm not sure if the Zagros Mountains are in Turkey, don't quote me on that. But if the Egyptian priest was saying that these mountains were higher than anything that existed in the world, I think they have to be comparable at least to the Alps or the mountains in Turkey or in Iran, because the Egyptians knew. This passage implies that the Egyptians really knew what they were talking about in terms of geography. And so what they were saying about the mountains of Atlantis actually being superlatively great and beautiful, I think we have to take them at their word. And quite simply, these mountains right here, they don't even come close to meeting that standard. As you can see in this diagram, these mountains are actually mountains. You can kind of imagine that they're several thousand feet high. These mountains here, they're not even mountains, they're barely hills. They're like maybe go up around 500 to 1,000 feet from this so-called plain in this city. And so I'll have to admit that the Richat structure does have a lot of things going for it. And I'm going to be talking about the advantages of the theory that the Richat structure is Atlantis in a future video. But I wanted to get these the weaknesses of this theory out first, because the idea that the Richat structure is Atlantis has just taken off and become so popular. And people are just so, the people who are actually interested in Atlantis, a significant portion of them have just kind of, they have this like blind faith in this theory, and the person who has popularized the theory, whose name is Jimmy Bright from Bright Insight. And let me just clear that up. That channel may have a lot more subscribers than I do. It may be a lot more popular than I do. Nobody knows who I am. Everybody knows who he is. But he makes videos on a lot of other topics other than Atlantis. And he's not an Atlantis expert by any means. And so the idea is that there are things that are wrong with that theory. And this video and the last two videos I made really show that the Richat structure just can't be Atlantis.